Hello everybody, my name's Ian Cresswell. Welcome to the IRM Northwest Regional Interest Group. Today's topic of discussion is one that is very much prevalent in today's disrupted world and one on all of our radars, and that of cyber risk. I'm Ian Cresswell, Director of Risk and Technology at South Liverpool Homes, and I'll be co-hosting today's session with Jeff Colley, who is Corporate Risk and Strategy Manager at Wayfield District Homes. Give us a wave, Jeff, please. Okay. We'll hear from two speakers today, David Morris from Deloitte and Matt Plummer from PwC, who will talk about the multiple threats we face and the impact this can have on our reputation. In the second session, Matt will particularly focus on the cyber risk associated with third parties. So firstly, I would like to introduce David Morris. David has been a good friend to this forum over the years in his previous role at RSM and brings 35 years experience of working in risk management. He has a wide experience of key process and disciplines such as internal audit, IT compliance, cybersecurity and data governance, and he's currently Associate Director within Deloitte's Technology and Digital Risk Service line. We've allowed 45 minutes for each presentation to allow for some time at the end for each one for questions. So if you do have questions, can I ask you that you post those in the question facility, which is in the GoToWebinar window at the top right of your screen. We'll endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end of each presentation. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, David.
Yeah.
Okay.
We got it?
Yeah, brilliant. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. So, as I said, as we've just been introduced, David Morris, I'm with Deloitte. Whilst I work in technology, I'm not actually good with things like webinars and direct technology, so forgive me if this doesn't go entirely to plan. So I'm going to talk about cybersecurity and the impact of getting it wrong, basically, and what it can mean for companies and individuals. Very happy to take any questions as we go through. Happy to take them at the end, whatever's easiest for yourself. So, a little bit of a reminder, what is cybersecurity and why it continues, the management of it continues to be hard going. I'm going to talk about some general trends. I'm going to give you some specific examples because it's always more fun where we see where other people have gone wrong, although we do like to think that we can learn from that. Talk about the impact of getting it wrong, and then some of the questions that we might want to ask ourselves as individuals or organizations at the end. So I hope that's okay. So in terms of what is cybersecurity, now clearly this is, might be a basic slide for lots of people. There are a number of different definitions, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to pull out on there. So you've got the NIST definition, which is cybersecurity is the ability to protect or defend the use of cyberspace. National Cybersecurity Centre introduces an angle that's very important to me, because they say cybersecurity is how individuals and organizations reduce the risk of cyber attack. So we've moved away from just large corporations and we're talking about ourselves as individuals as well. And then the Department for Business Innovation and Skills introduced another very important sort of starter, I suppose, which is it's not just the digital measures that you can take to reduce risk, it's the human measures. Because I think, as we probably all know, the human firewall is as important as the technical firewall, and it's the human firewall that actually fails most often. Lady there, I don't know if it's Dido or Dido actually, but she used to be head up of TalkTalk, and I think we all know the TalkTalk issue and what happened to them. And basically, that was her quote: "Teams that say that their cybersecurity is really good are the ones to worry about." So one of the things that we want to bring out from this is the need to avoid complacency in our cybersecurity defenses. So why the increase in risk? Well, this is a fairly busy diagram, and I'm just going to pick out some of these. And again, I think you will recognize most of these, particularly on the back of COVID-19 and working at home. Basically, everything is developing, everything is joining up, everything is producing much more data. Big data sets are being put together that are useful to hackers, useful to other people. We've got information that previously we had held securely, in our own offices, out on the cloud with third parties. I know Matt's going to talk about third-party risk, and that is quite an important thing to worry about at the moment. We've got people taking free apps off the internet and not really knowing what's in them. We've got the Internet of Things. There was a story today about a company that manages all sorts of building maintenance systems, and they've been hacked, and people are looking inside prisons and inside storage units and stuff through the cameras. So it's basically everything coming together, and the more complexity we get, the more difficult it is to manage that complexity. This is one of the most important slides for me. My motto is, you can't defend what you don't know you have. And I still work with quite a few organizations who don't really know where their cyber boundary is. So once upon a time, you had to worry about the bit that's in the middle, the dark bit in the middle, because that was the extent of your physical network. But now, perhaps you've got a payroll bureau, you've got information hosted in the cloud, you're using Office 365. You might be a company that shares data with a third party who pass it on to another party and who pass that on to somebody else. And all of a sudden, it's more difficult to know where your real cyber boundary actually is. And when data is at the margins, and when it's at that dotted line, that's when it's actually at most at risk to you, because you've got potentially less control over it, and you've got potentially less knowledge about where it's moving to and where it's moving from. And as you can see, McAfee estimate that cybercrime is costing as much as $600 billion in recent years. So this is why it's quite important to get it right. One thing I would urge you to take away from this talk is, what's my cyber footprint, either personally, or what's my cyber footprint as an organization. I always give the example of when I once did some work with a company. I did some work with the pensions department, and we rated their systems sort of 10 out of 10, but they passed information to the administrators, and we sort of said their systems are 8 out of 10. They passed information to the actuaries. We sort of gave them 6 out of 10. They passed information on to fund managers, etc. We gave them 4 out of 10. So as it got towards the margins, the control was diluted. It's quite a simplistic example, but it's an example nevertheless of the issue I'm talking about here. So cyber risk is increasing. And why is that? Well, it's not because we've had half our brain replaced by electronics, although it does feel that way sometimes. There's a number of things there. I'm just going to pick out a couple. We've already discussed the increasing network connections and dependencies. In some respects, cybercrime can be easier to do than it used to be, because you can go on the dark web and you can get attack packs. There are people who are doing attacks on people who don't actually really know what they're doing. The dark web in itself is an important market, both in terms of the source of attack and as a market for the information that is taken from people. So you might find bank records selling at 20p a pop in there, which doesn't sound that much until you realize that someone's taken 50 million bank records. Social media is definitely part of this. Obviously, we say social media as though it's a new thing, and we forget it's been around 15 years or so. But people overshare. Some of the memes and stuff that you see going around are designed to get the answers to your security questions. What's your mother's maiden name, that sort of thing. And more sophisticated phishers and whalers use the information they can get from social media to send you more direct phishing emails and whaling emails about, they'll see that you've been at a conference on LinkedIn. They'll send you an email saying, hope you enjoyed the conference, by the way, can you move this money from A to B, etc. And then the one at the bottom is the one I've already mentioned, which is sometimes it's just a lack of understanding of our own cyber footprint, which means that there are corners that we didn't realize that were at risk, that we need to think about and we need to protect. I mentioned before the people risk. People risk is a big thing for me. You can get all the technology right. People don't forget to put antivirus in. They might forget to patch it, but they don't forget to put it in. They don't forget to try and secure the network. They don't forget to think about the administration passwords. They do forget about the people risk sometimes. And again, long list, but a couple of things I want to pick out there. I've already discussed data in transit and data at the margins being a big risk. So much data on the move. One of the biggest, according to the ICO, one of the biggest failings that results in breaches for them is people emailing other people the wrong information. So, you know, a hospital trust accidentally emails a list of patients out to somebody that it wasn't supposed to go to. So old-fashioned error is still an issue. People like to trust people, and if somebody rings you up and says, I need some help getting into a system, people like to help them, but they may be up against somebody who's doing that as a day job. That's where sort of you will see ethical hackers and ethical phishing, because they're trying to test your defenses. The next one down, I think we can all relate to. You know, all got many accounts and passwords to juggle. So we tend to use the same password across all our accounts. And of course, once it's compromised once, it's compromised everywhere. So I've got something on my phone, which is antivirus software, which tells me if it thinks it's found any of my passwords elsewhere. Also, if you look at your Google account, you can do that as well. It will tell you if it's detected that any of your passwords have been implicated in breaches, etc. Social media we've discussed. I think an important one is underreporting of cybercrime. People don't like to say that they've been caught out, and therefore people don't learn the lessons from it. I think that's getting better. I think it's better than it was, but there's still, whatever figure you see on cybercrime and the amount of breaches, etc., it's not the true figure. It will always be more than that. Skill shortage. We need to find the right people to work on the side of the good guys. I think there's a lot of programs been developed and a lot of training courses that you can go on now, but you're still always playing catch up to the people who are trying to attack you. And I think overall, I just want to get the message out that whether we like it or not, staff continue to be the weak link, and we need to make sure there isn't a complacency culture at our organization. And if there is, then we need to see what we can do about it. Okay. And this is my illustration of what I'm talking about people being the weakest link. The fact that his name is Dave is completely coincidental and nothing to do with it. As another illustration of perhaps complacency that we need to deal with is this one. So there's a site called Information is Beautiful that's fantastic, because they do all this research on all sorts of different things, and they present them back in this series of charts. And there's one that they do that I've not got in here, which is the top 500 passwords as gleaned from attacks, and you will see things like password, and you will see things like Bond 007, which is not the sort of password you want to be using. This just puts those in categories, and as you can see, the two that stick out for me are the people who still build their password around their names, which would be meat and drink to any hacker, and the one at the bottom, which is truly random passwords, which is the way we're supposed to be going now, and look at the very small percentage compared to some of the others. I urge you to look at Information is Beautiful. There's all sorts of interesting things on there. I'd like to know what a rebellious rude password is. I can probably hazard a guess, but I perhaps won't do it in front of an audience. So let's just go through some recent trends. So in preparation for this, I did some digging, looked at some reports, etc. So ransomware continues to be a growing threat. According to Verizon, who do this survey every year, it's now 27% of malware incidents. Ransomware, where you click on something, it locks your systems, and then they want you to pay a fee or something to get the encryption key back. that's been growing mightily for the last few years, and it continues to grow. Insider risk, well, okay, 70% of breaches were caused by outsiders, which seems to suggest that 30% of breaches had help from the inside. Insider risk has always been an issue for businesses, regardless of whether it's in cyber or regardless of whether it's due to theft, shrinkage, that sort of thing. But we mustn't forget about it from a cyber perspective. And this is one of those areas where good old-fashioned controls come to the fore, checking out CVs, doing proper due diligence, etc., the sort of things that we always should have been doing. Identity theft, I looked at a Norton report, and this was quite interesting because, as you can see, 2/3 of people were concerned about their identity being stolen. And I think if you asked that question a few years ago, you wouldn't have seen a percentage that high. So that's clearly something that's in the public psyche now. Third-party risks on the right there. I'm going to let Matt talk about that, and I'm sure he's going to talk about assurance and trust standards in relation to third parties. And if he's not, I'm sure he's probably changing his slides as we speak. Error, I mentioned. The ICO publish regular statistics on what is behind the breaches that they deal with, and they split them by cyber incidents and non-cyber incidents. Non-cyber incidents continue to be the biggest number. Whaling and not phishing, that links back to what I was saying before. So good old-fashioned phishing is just a random email. Your HSBC account has been hacked, sent to anybody, and they hope that it might land with somebody who's got an HSBC account, unlike somebody like me who's got a NatWest account, and hopefully they're going to panic and do something about it. Targeted whaling is obviously they found out stuff about you, they've made it much more specific, and it's not as random as before. Some of the whaling emails I've seen recently have been much more professional than they used to be. You used to be able to spot them quite easily with poor grammar and bad English, and the email address they come from is still a big giveaway. I do notice that that's often not sort of spoofed or covered very well. So if you've got an email supposedly from Apple and it's coming from Jeff123@gmail, it's probably not from Apple. Crime as a service. Well, I think one thing that we need to stress is that people are stealing things to order. There are people out there whose day jobs are cybercrime. You'll see them on the news. You'll see offices where people clock in at 9 and leave at 5 in some countries. And whilst a lot of them, I'm sure, know what they're doing isn't legal, apparently some of them don't even realise. So when you get calls saying that you've had a criminal case coming up against you, can you pass over your HMRC details, or your Windows is about to expire, can they take control of your computer? It's people doing cybercrime as a day job. And then supplier fraud is the last one. There's an increasing trend for firms to be caught out by people pretending to be their suppliers. I've got a new bank account, can you change it to this? And you'd be surprised how many people do that on the basis of an email without necessarily having any sort of process to ring them back and check or talk to the company. I've had several examples recently of people falling foul to that. And the banks are also becoming a little bit more strict about giving money back as well to either individuals or organizations. So there's just some recent trends, and hopefully you might recognize some there in terms of what you've seen and what you read about. So we're just going to go through some of the attack vectors, just to give you some examples of sort of things we're up against. So we have the jokers. I realize some of you may have seen these before, but these are the people who hack into things just because they can. So this is in Canada. This is people hacking into one of those systems that tells you, what the queue's like, etc. I suspect I wouldn't be finding the joke if I was in the queue, but this is an example of what people can do. And it's also an example of people not necessarily hacking for monetary gain. You know, it's a traffic management system. This one, I hope, works. So on that one, that's not actually a hack. That is an example of somebody using a building management system to play Tetris down the outside. But there are plenty of examples where people have hacked into those sort of systems for their advantage. So a recent one was a certain football club who I'm not sure what the current status is, but you know, if you could hack into a football club and turn the sprinklers on in the middle of the game or something, you know, that might be of benefit to people who are paying you to interrupt betting or something like that. I'm just going to see if I can get past this without it playing again. Insider attacks. The chap on the right is the one that we all know about, who and he's been through a series of court cases, or his firm has. Basically, he took advantage of the fact that he was on the inside to take information with him when he was sacked for doing certain things that he shouldn't have been doing. He used that information, he tried to sell it, he used it to attack other people. He got jailed. Then there was a big court case about whether his employer was responsible, and they were found responsible initially, as in it didn't matter what they did, they were still found responsible. And then there was an appeal, and I think the current status is that they were judged to have done as much as they could have done. The one on the left is just another example of an insider attack, but they think it was done from the inside, and it was the virus that did various things like replacing the images on corporate PCs was carried on a data stick. So insider risk is a big thing. It's always been a big thing. As you saw from the statistics, it's still smaller than outsider risk, but we shouldn't forget about it. Hacktivists, there are plenty of people out there who have got an agenda. This is quite a well-known one that spilled over into real life. I think you can read it for yourself, but basically somebody hacked into the Mumsnet site, which is obviously about, it's a site for ladies and mothers initially, and said it was anti-male, anti-dad. They took it down, they stole some accounts. Then it spilled over into real life, and the people who did this were ringing up the police, and armed police were going around to the homes of some of the users and one of the organisers. So that's an example of somebody with a particular grudge doing things they shouldn't be doing, and also how it can become quite serious. I mean, imagine if you're faced with armed police at your house. Excuse me. Crime syndicates we have discussed. I think you will have all seen these. The one on the left is standard phishing. You know, can you give us our details even though you've never had a package? As you can see, what I said about the URLs, it's not always quite as easy as hovering over it to see it come up with evilhacker.com, but it's always interesting to do that just to see where you're actually being directed to. And then the one on the right is ransomware that I received once upon a time. As you can see, it's quite sophisticated. That would worry a lot of people. And then state-owned companies, I won't spend too long on this, other than to say, yeah, and I always like to be careful here, not name names, just in case anybody comes after me. There are countries who have departments devoted to false information, trying to get information from other countries, industrial espionage, trying to find out about, you know, fighter plane development, etc. And the famous example is Sony, where they were hacked allegedly by North Korea because they were producing this film that wasn't kind about North Korea. And there was a lot of fallout for them in terms of some of the emails that were released were flying around, and the film itself. Identity theft. As we saw, this is an increasing issue for people. Two people on the left even, sorry, are famous for turning out to be not who they said they were. Anastasia Romanoff, the princess who said she survived the shootings of the Russian royal family, turned out it wasn't her. And this chap who the film Catch Me If You Can was based on, who pretended to have all sorts of different things. So all I'm saying is that identity theft is not a new thing, but it has moved into the new era. And if people can get your information, they will use it for housing benefit fraud. They will use it to get access to health that they're not entitled to. They'll use it to get out of congestion charges, etc. This one is quite common. 17-year-olds pass their tests, very happily put a picture of their license up on WhatsApp or whatever, say, I passed my test. Instantly taken, gone, cloned, and they're getting congestion tickets and speeding tickets, etc. I'm not aware that Will Smith has ever been cloned, but that was the best license that I could come up with. And then social media. So let's just talk about social media. Don't say the wrong thing on social media. It will come back to bite you. I think we know, some of you will know this story about the lady who was going to do work for a charity in Africa. Before she left, she sent an offensive tweet about going to Africa. She flew to Africa. While she was in the air, the tweet went viral and she was effectively already sacked by the time she got there. She also appeared in a book by John Ronson about the impact of it on her as well, which is quite a good read. So social media, this isn't an example of people oversharing as such. This is an example of how people can get themselves into trouble, or how companies can get themselves into trouble as well, because there are plenty of companies who have posted things that have caused backlashes in terms of sales or in terms of what people think of them. A couple of quotes about social media. I like the one on the right. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens on Twitter stays on Google forever. And that applies to whether it's a company or an organization or an individual. I'd like to know who this influencer is. I've never heard of them, but I like the quote. So these are the risks then. So let's talk about the impact of all of this. So any one of these could be a fallout from you having a cyber issue. And maybe some of you have had an issue at your organizations and you can see what happened in these. You've got the basic stuff like losing your systems or the cost of fixing systems, but then it can bleed into other areas like, well, maybe you're going to have higher cyber insurance costs in the future, or maybe because you've lost money, you're going to suffer poor credit ratings. I mean, I think you will get the slides and I can leave you to read those. But as you can see, they were how many are there? 15. They were the 15 that are able to fit on the page. And I suspect there are even more. This is the real impact. So I got these from looking at the news. There's nothing that's not already out there here. I'm just going to pull out a couple for you. So when we talk about financial loss, it can be real financial loss. So Oklahoma State Troopers Pension Fund had a sort of physical or technical $4.2 million stolen. That's just gone from the account. Operational disruption. I mean, everyone remembers WannaCry. Honda had to shut down its operations in Japan at some plants. So trust me, those of you who know manufacturing, it's not cheap or easy to stop and start a production line. Reputational loss of customer confidence. How much confidence do people who could not get their exam results have in an organization? How much confidence do students who had their details exposed have in a university? Legal action. This is quite a new thing. Increasingly, the ambulance chasers, now that certain other routes have been shut down, like PPI, etc., are now going after data breaches. So if they think you're implicated in a data breach, they'll say, do you want us to do sort of class action on your behalf? So BA have already been exposed to this. The reason I know this is because my details are amongst those 38,000 records that were exposed. So I've been bombarded with emails about it. And Hackney, well, there's a knock on here, which was that if they couldn't pay housing benefits, so potentially people were going to get evicted, which in itself was going to incur legal action. So I'll go past third-party risk, but I think the cloud one is quite interesting there. FedEx is quite an interesting example because it bought a company and shut it, but it didn't know that there was all this data in an unused Amazon bucket, and it was hacked. I don't think it did them a lot of damage, but it goes to show about the importance of knowing your footprint, particularly if you are acquiring other companies and you don't know their background. So what's this mean? Well, interestingly enough, there's evidence that's beginning to suggest that the reputational impact on a business can be short-lived, because whilst we have, and I'm not underplaying all those other things that we say can happen, because they do happen and they can cause a lot of damage to organizations. Share prices do recover. Rightly or wrongly, customers are beginning to, that doesn't make sense, right? But that should say customers are beginning to see data breaches as par for the course and not taking so much notice of them. And again, the complacency kicks in. Oh, it's another sort of data breach, etc. But where we've spoken about the impact on the individual, and that can take much longer to recover from, because if you get a bit of a Twitter pile on something or something like that, it can have much more longer lasting impacts on the individual than a data breach is seeming to have sometimes on an organization. So what can we do about all this? Well, this is the way that we look at it at Deloitte. This is the way I have always looked at it. We need to think about the 5 pillars of cybersecurity. It's about getting the technology right. I think that's a given, and most people would understand that. We need to think about getting process right, and a lot of this is process that supports the technology. So, we've got technology that enables us to see who's coming in and out of systems. Have we got a process that actually means that we look at it? We've got technology where we've got up-to-date sort of security tools. Have we got a process for patching and keeping them up to date? Third parties are a big risk simply in terms of your footprint and thinking about how you manage those third parties. People is always the biggest risk for me. How are we going to get them into a security culture that suits our organization and suits the way we work whilst protecting it? And then governance. What are our policies? What are our procedures? What's our cybersecurity strategy? Who's responsible for what? And if you can get those 5 things right, you're going some way towards protecting against your cyber risk. In terms of staff, what does staff need to worry about? Well, this is a summary of the things I've already spoken about. Mobile working and bring your own device has been very relevant the last year or so, and remote working. But staff need to think about their online safety, what they put out when they're out there. They need to think about how they handle information in all its forms, be it a paper file or an email. They need to think about whether what they're doing in their personal life presents a risk to their corporate life, etc. So a lot of things to think about there. And then to finish, I'm just going to go through these quickly. I think these are the questions that an organization needs to ask itself. So who's owning management of cyber risk? And is that owner the right person? What sort of training are we getting about this issue? And that needs to be continuous. Once a year isn't enough. It needs to be constant, drip feed, innovative. Are we looking at the right things? Well, that's a judgment call for each organization. And do we have a cyber risk escalation framework? I think that one's quite important because we often see that people are good at identifying issues, but then they're not so good at dealing with them. So incident management, breach management, that sort of thing is very important. If you think about the people and security culture, what's our mindset? How are we managing this? Third-party risks, again, so you can see why Matthew is talking about third parties, because it's a theme through here. Response, etc., etc., etc. I'll just go down to this one. An interesting one is how are you doing compared to others? It's not necessarily always the best judge, but if I'm in a company that's a long way behind what other people in my sector are doing, I might be asking questions as to why. And then there's some more philosophical ones at the bottom. How are we managing our change? Change is vital to any organization. Change is the lifeblood of an organization, but change also brings the risk in terms of new data sets, turning off accidentally security that you had before, etc. And then what's our position? Are we reacting to cyber events, or are we attacking them head on and trying to prevent them? So a few questions that you want to ask yourselves there, which I hope will be useful. Last couple of slides now, and then I can take some questions. So I think my summary is this in terms of key actions. Somebody senior needs to drive this. It needs to come organically from the bottom, but also needs to come from an executive stance at the top, tone at the top, that sort of thing. Only you can know what your own risk profile is, but part of that is knowing who your third parties are, what your cyber footprint is, what your risky processes are, what your most valuable data sets are. As with anything, as with any project, it's important to have visible early wins to keep people interested, to keep momentum going. And the other two, accelerate behavior change. Easy to say, not so easy to do, but you might have to think about behavioral change at an organization. And then, yeah, still continue to trust people, but we need to check. And that's the basis of third-party assurance, internal audits, penetration tests, etc., etc., etc. So, hope that's my little overview of cyber risk and impact. Hope that's been useful. I'm happy to take any questions at this point if I can get the technology to work and I can see them.
Yeah, I can do that for you, David. So
Brilliant.
Thanks. That was very informative. We've just got a couple of questions in the chat. One on a more practical note, really, which I think you answered partway through the presentation around will the slides be made available? And so I can probably answer that question for you in the fact that we will make the slides available on the Northwest Regional Interest Group of the IRM site. So which we've done that before. There's a question from one question. You mentioned the importance of incident response. What does good incident response look like? And I just had a question, maybe because you've got 5 minutes at the end, just around. Do you think we've seen an increase in cybercrime since the pandemic started? So people working from home, dispersed networks. Has that impacted on organisations' ability to control their networks and their information security? So
yeah, good point. So if I can answer the first one about incident response, what does good incident response look like? Well, firstly, feeding into that, we have to have some mechanisms of actually identifying what the issues are. What we don't want then is having lots of good information lying around is not using it. So we've got to clarify what sort of events concern us. Now, clearly you've got the straightforward somebody in the system hacking, but you've got other things that may be of more importance to other people. But then what you've got to have good incident response means having people who can make decisions about what you're going to do, having speed. So by the time you've spent 3 days discussing what you want to do about your hack, they've gone through your systems and they've had what they want. So it's definitely having people who've got the ability to make a decision rather than having a massive committee that needs to be convened. It's about speed of response, and it's about knowing what you think your actions would be as a sort of desktop exercise. I mean, for some people, it's as simple as pulling the plug on a server. For other people, they may not be able to do that. So what you don't want is, at this point, right, we need to do something. We've never thought about what we would do in this instance. So, and also in incident response, you've got to think about communication. So what are you going to tell staff, customers, third parties? One of the things about the Yahoo, no, not Yahoo, sorry, the TalkTalk attack was less that it was a massive amount of figures and numbers. It was more that the response given was a bit ambiguous and didn't give the right messages, and it was actually the poor response that alarmed most customers rather than the actual hack itself. So I hope that answers that one. And then in answer to your question, well, I suspect we shall see this when we look at the surveys next year. But did cyber criminals try and cash in on the pandemic? Absolutely. Loads of emails about furloughing and tax returns and all sorts of stuff. So the same people carried on doing what they were doing, but they changed the tone of the attack. There are some figures that's from Checkpoint, which is the Israeli software company, who said that they saw a massive uptake, increase even, in people setting up malicious websites linked to the pandemic that people were being aimed at through a phishing email, etc. So I think we will see a big increase, and not least because I think some people had to rush into remote working. Some organizations had to rush into remote working without necessarily preparing the staff for what that meant in terms of some of the basic things, even things as basic as you know, if you print off confidential stuff at home, don't put it in your ordinary bin, that sort of thing. So I think we will see an increase, but I've also been quite impressed by the way that most organizations have reacted, which seems to suggest that anybody who didn't want to go to remote working, it wasn't always just because it was a technical or a security issue, it was because some people just didn't want to do it. That's just my opinion, but it's been proved now that we can do it, and that is going to continue, and that will definitely alter the risk profile for organizations who suddenly have half their workforce at home.
Okay, thank you, David. We've got a number of other questions that have now appeared, David, and I'm conscious of the fact that I don't want to steal Matt's time, so we've got a couple of minutes. I'll just pick out a couple, and then
Sure.
we'll answer them in the question facility. For those ones we don't answer on the screen, we'll answer them in the facility within GoToWebinar. So,
yeah.
Have you seen any statistics on the percentage of companies that have paid a ransomware but haven't had their data released?
Good question. I've never seen any statistics on that, but I do know that companies do pay fees. Companies won't tell you that they've paid because it doesn't look good in reputation. But interesting enough, as a business model, it's not in the interests of the hacker to not release the systems and data if you've paid the fee. Because if word gets around that if you pay, you don't get it anyway, then they're not going to do it. So I haven't seen any statistics because it's not something that people want to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. Then the final question we'll answer on the screen then. Do you agree that it's worth considering priorities where it's not possible to manage all of those cyber risks? For example, classifying information, segmenting third parties for information security risk, etc. So I guess there's a lot for us to think about, and you know, what should be our priorities?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the risk management way of approaching it, sort of, you know, what's going to cause me the biggest impact in the shortest time, let me address those first. But I would not, whatever that comes out at, then I would include people on top of that at all times as well.
Okay, Great, David. Right, we're bang on time, so I'll bring Jeff and Matt in now. If you could turn your cameras on, and I'll hand over the screen to Matt.
Okay, thank you, Ian, and thank you, David. I'll just introduce Matt to yourselves. Matt's a manager at PwC's Northwest Technology Data and Analytics team. And Matt's got over 9 years experience working in technology, advisory, and IT audit projects. And Matt specializes in third-party IT risk management. And Matt works with clients and their key third parties to ensure that their approach to IT service management, business continuity, and cybersecurity are fit for purpose. And Matt's topic covers the area of risks surrounding things like outsourcing and virtualizing. And these are all areas that ourselves and others are thinking about doing more and more of as we start trying to hold our data off premises. So it's something that's very relevant to us. And so it's something that I'm sure a lot of us will take a lot of key points away from the from Matt's presentation. So over to you, Matt.
Okay, thank you very much. So hopefully you can all see my slides. So firstly, I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me along today to present to you. As Jeff has just said, I think third-party IT risk is a really important area for us to delve into in a little bit more detail. And I guess part of the reason for that is obviously it's something it's a bit of a hot topic at the minute. There's a lot of areas in this that are kind of growing, but it's also an area that's very pervasive. So, you know, throughout David's presentation, he was alluding to third-party risk at various points. So, regardless of the extent to which you kind of think about your IT estate and say, right, I'm definitely using all of these outsourced providers, somewhere in there will be third-party risk. And it's really important that you've got mechanisms, processes in place to actually kind of identify that. So as Jeff kind of covered, I'm a manager in our technology data and analytics team at PwC, and I specialize in third-party risk management across public, private sector, worked under lots of different outsourcing models, and I guess typically I either help clients to design and review their monitoring and oversight processes, or I will actually do some deep dives for them. So I might go into a third party and look at, okay, how are their controls over something like patch management, or how are their controls over, you know, running a SOC on behalf of an organization. So what I want to cover off today is firstly just having a bit of a conversation about what is outsourced IT. So what are we considering when we think about third-party risk? Where are some of those sources that you're likely to come across in your business? And then thinking a little bit about some of the benefits and challenges that come out of that. So where do we have you know, good things? Where do we have the bad things? And then finally, just spending a little bit of time to kind of bring it back to content that's kind of really relevant for yourselves in terms of how do we actually handle this risk? What should we do? So what is outsourced IT? If we think about it at its kind of most basic level, it's basically procuring software, services related to IT that you don't really have to look after yourselves. Someone else is doing all of that for you. So there's a lot of different types of outsourcing. And in particular, I think one of the areas I kind of want to focus on today is largely around cloud computing and some of the risks that come with that. But it's important to just have a bit of an understanding of what that broad outsourcing model looks like. So starting with infrastructure as a service, which is kind of like your bottom layer of cloud computing. So this is basically making sure that you've got the servers, the kind of rack space, to be honest, in these data centers there and ready for you to use. You can then kind of take a step up from that to something called platform as a service. So this is where these companies will then start to kind of build a layer on top of that to actually manage some of the underlying infrastructure in more detail for you. So you don't have to worry about things like the operating systems or the databases or anything that kind of sits underneath that. They'll look after all of that for you. And then finally, you've got that top level of software as a service, which is probably one of the areas that a lot of people are more familiar with. So companies like Salesforce, like Zoom, like Slack, are all examples of software as a service providers. So in these instances, you have very little to do as an end user. You know, they're doing all of the kind of development. Maybe there's some opportunity for you to do configuration and things on your end to just tailor it a little bit to how you want it. But generally, you're buying that product and you're using that product mostly as it comes. So there are other kind of, I guess, categories of cloud computing. So there's a lot of things around data and analytics and reporting. But generally, these are probably the three main ones that you'll come across. The other types of outsourcing that we've got are some of the kind of more traditional outsourcing models that we think of. So things like onshoring, nearshoring, offshoring. So these are the kind of circumstances where we take a particular process or particular parts of a process and give it to someone else to do. You've also got managed services where you get a company to kind of come in and look after a specific area for you. So it could be something like voice over IP, data storage, managed security. And I think one of the questions that I get a lot with this part of it is, what's the difference between the onshoring, nearshoring, offshoring side and the managed services side? And it really comes down to how these third parties engage with you. So with the kind of traditional onshoring model, your third parties are generally there to do a particular function, and that's all that they kind of care about. That's all their scope is. So they might do some coding for you, say. They're not going to sit there and look at all of your processes and say, right, is this actually a good coding standard to use? Is it the right thing for what we're trying to achieve here? Have we got the right policies, governance in place to kind of deal with all of this? How do we make sure that we don't fall foul of things like change management, and that when auditors come in to look at our systems, we'll be able to actually prove that we're doing the right types of things? So they have a much more limited remit and work under, I guess, what you could call a break it, fix it model. So what I mean by that is they've got the skills, they've got the experience, they've probably got the people there to help you, but they're definitely going to make you pay to do it. So if you did have an issue with your process, sure, we can help you out with that, but it's going to cost you this much. Managed services is a little bit different. So with a managed service, you're passing some of the kind of responsibility and accountability for some of these services over to those third parties, and you're saying, right, I want you to look after my identity and access management process, as an example, and I'm relying on you to make sure that that is fit for purpose, it's good practice, it aligns to our organizational policies and procedures. It's a much more proactively managed and maintained relationship. So that tends to be where I'm seeing a lot of my clients go now. They're taking discrete parts of their IT and outsourcing it to particular providers who then effectively just get managed and monitored by the client to make sure that they're comfortable with what's being done. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the different types of outsourcing that exist, let's think about why it's really relevant right now. So PwC did a survey recently of about 3,200 IT executives. This is international. And of those, 75% said that they're moving their operations into the cloud. And 76% said they're actually actively moving their kind of cybersecurity into the cloud as well. So this is very clearly an area that everyone is kind of taking forward. People want to use more cloud services. The kind of old on-premise infrastructure largely seems to be dying off. Like if I think about the clients that I work with, the vast majority of them now have a kind of cloud-first mentality. So they're always looking at how they can kind of take things forward. How can we get rid of some of these old legacy systems that we're having to pay to maintain, and how do we get onto the cloud? So why is everyone so keen to do that? What are the benefits? What are the challenges of actually kind of working under that cloud model? So if we think about why companies outsource IT, the first one is that it allows you to reduce your IT costs, potentially, if it's done right. And an interesting part of this that I think shouldn't be overlooked is that it actually leads to lower capital costs. So for a lot of organizations, investing in licenses for a particular piece of cloud software is a lot less scary than that whole process of procuring infrastructure, of putting project teams together to develop applications with maybe on your own or with a systems integrator or a third party to help you. It feels like a much less risky endeavor financially. So there's a lot of appetite for taking forward those models where they exist. It also gives you access to a set of specialist skills which you maybe don't have. And this is largely going to depend on a few different factors. Your size of your organization, the location even. So if you're a relatively small company in the middle of nowhere, how are you able to attract the right people with the skills that you need to actually kind of maintain and manage your IT? It's not always that easy. So often in those scenarios, it can be better to outsource and take advantage of some of the specialist skills and the people that these companies can kind of parachute in to look after things. It gives you a lot of flexibility as well. So I guess what I mean by that is you have the ability to kind of access these systems from almost anywhere. So in the last kind of year or so, I think this is something that's become particularly relevant. So many organizations have kind of rolled out things like Zoom because it's just such an easy option to deploy software quickly, efficiently, and make sure that people can kind of get back online and get working. And that's not always that easy with some of the kind of sort of legacy systems and the old infrastructure. That time to kind of speed up and actually get these things online used to be a lot longer. And similarly to that, you get scalability. So what I really mean by scalability is the ability to kind of spin up or spin down servers and services as and when you need them. Before, to actually get a server or something set up in a data center, you're talking, days, weeks, some cases even months to get these things online. With the kind of new kind of sort of cloud computing, the infrastructure as a service, you're talking minutes. Like I recently saw a presentation by Microsoft on their Azure platform, and they were able to spin a server up in about 30 seconds and have it actually running something functional, which is just a whole different world to what we've had before. And finally, you get this kind of point about improved resilience. So, traditionally you had your data center, which might have been on premise, it might have been run by somebody else. You usually have another site that maybe it's the next town over, maybe it's another city. Your data is kind of replicated over, and then someone is taking some kind of off-site backups and taking them away with them. So whether that is to a company like Iron Mountain that can kind of manage those backups for you, or sometimes it's even just taking it back to your IT director's house who just sits there with a big pile of disks. I have seen that before. So you now have access to this amazing kind of virtualization platform where your data can just be almost seamlessly moved around these different servers. So if something does go down somewhere, you can, to the end user, with very little kind of perception, be back online and running much, much faster than you ever could have done before. So thinking about, I guess, a good example of this. So where have we seen something particularly cyber related where cloud computing has done something really good? And I think a great example of this was last June, where Amazon managed to thwart the largest ever denial of service cyber attack. So for those of you that don't know what denial of service cyber attack is, it's essentially just aimed at trying to overload and shut down companies' systems and services. And it's not a very sophisticated attack. The way that they do it is just pretty much firing data at those servers to try and make them just run out of processing power and just die. So this was a 2.3 terabyte a second DDoS attack, which, to kind of put it in context, is like someone trying to just push 500 DVDs worth of information a second straight at you. It was 44% larger than any other attack that's been done on AWS and the largest detected cyber attack, DDoS attack in history. And they dealt with it. They dealt with it relatively easy. They have a product called AWS Shield, and it took them about 3 days to kind of get things back to normal, but they were able to kind of successfully mitigate this attack. and didn't have any real impact on any of their customers. And that's just a level of protection that you don't get in your own kind of infrastructure, unless you are investing significantly. And I think even then, I don't think you'd be able to necessarily deal with an attack of this scale and magnitude. There's maybe a few companies out there in the world that have got that capability to do it. So this is one of the great benefits of cloud computing, right? You get access to the resources of a company like Amazon, who are throwing so much of that behind actually helping to keep your information resilient, keep your data secure. But there are also a lot of challenges that come with it. So yes, these companies have a lot of size, you know, they're massive companies, big scale, really good for kind of helping to protect your information. But to them, generally, you're a very, very small fish in a big pond. So unless you are a very large organization, you're going to be kind of dancing to their tune when it comes to things like contracts, to terms and conditions, to some of the recovery time and recovery point objectives that you've got to set as a business. So you've got to be kind of aware of that going into these relationships, that actually they might not be able to change around you, and you're potentially going to have to change around them. And from a risk perspective, you're going to have to then think about what that means. You've also got the potential kind of challenge of a lack of in-house knowledge. So great, we outsource all our IT to all these different people. We get rid of people who maybe had some of the kind of skills and experience in those areas. How do we actually challenge those third parties on what they're doing? Do we know what good practice looks like? Do we know what the questions are, what the metrics that we need to ask for are? And can they just kind of, I guess, overwhelm us with technobabble, which I've seen quite a lot as well, where third parties will almost kind of try and obscure some of the practices that they're doing that are not great by just confusing you. It can be very, very difficult to kind of get through that sometimes. The other challenge is you kind of coordinating multiple third parties. So I guess what I mean by that is, yeah, okay, you might have some of your infrastructure running on AWS. You might also have some of it running on Azure. You might have some of it that's still in-house. You might use software as a service across different areas of your business. You might have outsourced processes, whether they are IT related or even business processes that you might outsource, such as payroll. How do you coordinate all of that? How do you bring all of that together to really understand, okay, what's my exposure to both cyber risk and also, I guess, from a resiliency perspective? So if something goes down at this third party, is that going to affect this third party that's over here? Big question and very difficult to get a clear picture of. And as David was saying earlier, it is those bits that are kind of right around the edge where things tend to go wrong and you tend to miss things, or you know, there's unexpected risk that you just didn't kind of capture and identify. So what does that mean? Well, as a starting point, it means you've got a significant reliance on others to get it right. Like, you need these companies to know what they're doing and be able to make sure that they are keeping all of that information, all of those processes, all of that kind of trust that you're putting in them, and keeping it all safe. It's also very easy to get a false sense of security with these things as well. So you think about some of the names that are involved in this: Google, Amazon, Microsoft. These are big blue chip companies that you're sort of sat there thinking, well, they're too big to fail. Surely they can't get this wrong. They've got the resources, they've got the infrastructure. But that's not always the case. So I don't know how many of you would actually remember this, but just before Christmas last year, there was a global outage of Gmail, YouTube, pretty much every service that Google offers. So I felt this one quite keenly because you probably can't tell, but I'm actually presenting to you now from Google Slides. So us as a firm are all based on Google. So this is something that actually affected PwC as well. And it's a really interesting one in that it's such a simple problem that happened. So they have an authentication server, which manages all the credentials of the people trying to log in and access their services. And the storage just got full. Storage got full. It was supposed to automatically expand using this fantastic capability that they've got, and it didn't. and as a result, that server crashed. And when that service went down, that was the best part of probably 2-3 hours that all of that was out. So these are the kind of things that you've got to sort of think about and actually say, you know what, we've got to prepare for this. Like, we can't just rely on the fact that it is Google to make sure that things are okay. So just thinking about from our own perspective, you know, almost immediately we were all receiving text messages explaining what was going on. We had alternative mechanisms for doing things like calls, for making sure that we could actually carry on with our work. And it's important that we've got those types of plans in place to do this. So another example I kind of wanted to bring out, which again, I don't know if people will have heard of this or if people will have maybe come across this one, is around Blackboard. So for those of you that don't know, Blackboard are a software as a service provider that look at fundraising and relationship management. So they're largely used across charities or higher education, those type of industries. That's where I've come across them most. And basically, they were subject to a ransomware attack. They managed to stop it, but not before the third party managed to steal a bunch of their data. And interestingly to what David was saying earlier, they did pay, and it's known that they paid this ransomware demand. Their rationale being that, you know, their primary concern was keeping their customers' data safe, so they felt it was in the best interest of the customer to just pay and get rid of this. Generally not advised. So, you know, things like NIST would generally say, generic government advice, nah, don't pay, not usually a great idea. And what's interesting is they don't really know, has it definitely gone? They think the data's gone, but can they say for certain? Is that data out there somewhere waiting to potentially be used at a later date? I still don't think that full picture is understood. And certainly from some of the clients that I've worked with who have been affected by this, I don't really think they know either. So this is just another example of where actually, you know, with very little input from your own organization, things can and will go wrong. So thinking about some of those risks to individual organizations then, I guess one of the key ones is thinking about regulatory and compliance. So something like GDPR is probably front and center in most people's minds. So with a platform like Google or Microsoft, where is your data stored? So do you even know? Do you actually know, like, okay, it's in this data center, it's in this cluster, is it even in the UK? You know, could be all across Europe if you're not sure where it's gone. So it's important that you're firstly kind of keeping track of where your data is and what exactly is being stored where from that regulatory perspective. But then you've also got to ensure that they're managing that effectively. So how do they make sure on their end that people aren't getting access to your data? You know, you're sharing a lot of these public cloud services with other organizations. How do you make sure that, you know, people aren't able to access both, or if something gets compromised on one of the other clients because they've made some bad decisions about their security or their infrastructure, how do you make sure that they can't kind of then jump over from that into your systems? We've talked a little bit already about some of the kind of impact of losing your in-house skills and expertise, but it is something that's kind of very important. You've got to be able to make sure that you can effectively challenge these organizations, and without those skills, it's very hard. You lose a lot of transparency, and I think this is something that kind of came out particularly in that Blackboard example that I gave you, where these organizations, yeah, there's a load of stuff going on in the, you know, behind the scenes to kind of make sure that they're doing what they can to get that data back. They're forensically assessing it and trying to find out what's going on. But you as an end user, do you know that? You know, are they telling you that? Certainly from some of the discussions that I've had around this, it feels like in that particular scenario, it took a while for organizations to get notified. So some of this stuff could be happening with your third parties, and they might not tell you. You just don't know. There's also an interesting point around the lack of alignment between cloud services and your existing infrastructure. And this is something that affected one of my clients just last week. So they have now moved a lot of their information onto the cloud, and a lot of the services that they're using are all kind of cloud-based services. But their own network infrastructure, just locally, hasn't really kind of kept up to speed with that. So they had one firewall fail, just one, and the failover to their kind of backup didn't happen as expected, and it took out all of their online services for, I think, the best part of half a day. And there was a point that they're genuinely considering, you know, are we able to kind of carry on functioning as a business today, or are we you know, in real trouble? Do we need to go and invoke you know, all of these kind of disaster recovery, business continuity arrangements that they've got in place, and really kind of switch to emergency mode? And they didn't really have a great plan for that, because they'd not really expected it. It was an area of their infrastructure where they just didn't really see that there was going to be that much of a weakness. It was supposed to be managed by somebody, and they kind of just sort of forgot about it. So actually, just move, you know, saying you're moving to the cloud, moving this software into the cloud doesn't really mitigate some of this risk. You've got to make sure that your own infrastructure is up to be, you know, up for that and able to, you know, deal with it. You've also got questions around the kind of lack of portability. So great, we've made the jump to cloud, we've gone to one of these big platforms. What if we ever want to get off? What if the pricing suddenly changes and it becomes not viable for us? How easily can we get our data out of there? How easy is it to then transfer to another provider? You know, what does that do to the kind of infrastructure or the code base of some of these applications? Are we able to do this seamlessly? Sometimes you can actually get yourself a bit stuck with some of these third parties, and whether that is technically in that it's actually really hard to get your infrastructure off there, or contractually, you know, you might find that actually you've locked yourself into something that thinking about a change in, you know, strategy or direction of the business is no longer the best thing for you. So it's important that throughout all of this kind of process of moving to these, you know, cloud providers, these outsourced organizations, we start to think about how we address these risks. So I'll give you another example from one of my clients recently, where they've outsourced some of their services to a third party. The company that they've outsourced them to, well known, very big in this space. So this, I guess, is an example that just goes to show that even some of these big name companies don't always get things right. So the company had outsourced most of their aspects of IT service management, and they relied significantly on that technical knowledge of the third party to kind of look after those processes. So they'd maybe meet with them once a month, sit in a room, or now over a conference call, and say, okay, how are things going? You know, what's the patch status like? Have we got any key risks that we need to know about, or generally are we okay? And the third party would turn around and they go, yeah, no, you're fine, nothing to worry about here. And they'd kind of turn around and say, yeah, okay, fine. And that's it. And we then went in to look at the processes of this third party and found that actually a lot of these systems had, you know, significantly out of date in terms of their patching. They've got critical security vulnerabilities in there. The change management process that this third party was following was awful, just almost completely ineffective, almost amazing that it hadn't fallen over more already. And the quality of the information that was coming back to my client as part of their reporting processes was just not fit for purpose. But the client had never really thought to challenge this, or hadn't got the kind of mechanisms in place to challenge this. So as a result, they were kind of going along saying, yeah, it's maybe not the best, but we don't think there's any kind of huge risks there. And clearly, in this example, their understanding of what their third party was doing was just not fit for purpose. So, second example, very, very similar. Also outsourced aspects of their IT service management, but this time had really robust monitoring in place. So really clearly defined KPIs, regular meetings, you know, lots of involvement in kind of actually understanding how policy and procedure is being applied, and they worked collaboratively. And this is something that's great to see when you have these third parties that are kind of taking aspects of this process off of you, and you are working collaboratively to put the right process in place for your business. The difference was night and day. You know, they had a really clear understanding of where their risk exposure was. They understood what all the mitigating actions were for where they got kind of legacy environments that they couldn't keep up to date, or where they couldn't apply security patching because it would break systems. They have really robust processes to drive forward change, and the management information they were getting was just much better. But it brings its own set of challenges, this, and it comes back to that kind of portability point. So they've got this process so ingrained and so embedded with this third party that there's actually a risk to them there. So I think 2 years it is until their contract's up for renewal, and they've got to make a decision as to, do we want to renew and carry on with this third party, or do we need to look elsewhere? And it's very hard for them to look elsewhere in this scenario, because actually what they're getting is so embedded into their own existing processes. You know, the teams are working so well collaboratively that it's very unlikely that they'll be able to get that same quality as, you know, from day one with another service provider. So even when you do things right, it doesn't get rid of the risk. It doesn't reduce all of that risk. In fact, sometimes it even brings different risk into the picture. So what can we do to actually handle some of this outsourced IT risk then? And I think this is where it kind of can seem quite difficult. So you'll sit there and you'll think, well, actually, how do I, as a business, really understand what my third parties are doing? How much information do I need? What's the right level of assurance to be getting? And the answer is actually it's kind of fairly simple. So if we think about the types of risks that we face, it covers a broad spectrum, but it fits into well-known categories. So a lot of the time it could be regulatory risk. So we've touched on things like GDPR earlier, but there's also a regulation, I guess, things like PCI DSS that can potentially come into play. There's financial risk there. So sometimes these third parties will be managing financial processes on your behalf. There's obviously a risk with some of these services. Well, if they go down, you kind of lose some of your money, some of your production. Operationally, if you lose these services, how do you kind of carry on as a business? Security, how do we make sure that that data is secure? There's obviously a risk that, I guess, both that their systems can be compromised, but also that individuals within those organizations could potentially be malicious as well. So there's nothing that necessarily stops one of these outsourced staff from potentially just using that privileged access that a lot of the time they have to your data to take things away, potentially sell it, or commit fraudulent activity. And finally, you've got that reputational piece. And reputational risk is a really interesting one, because it's the one that you really can't outsource. You can't get rid or transfer reputational risk. You know, if something goes down with your outsourced provider that affects your system, it's still your name that's a lot of the time going to be dragged through the mud. So it's really important that you understand exactly what information you've got and where it's held with your third parties. So coming back to basics a bit then, and hopefully all of these kind of terminologies will be familiar with you from ISO 31000. But we need to make sure that what we're doing is proportionate. And this is really, really important, because there's so many third parties that you might be working with. How do you make sure that you're focusing your time and attention when it comes to management and oversight on the right ones? So the first thing that you kind of got to do is think about, okay, what do we have with these third parties? How critical is it to our business? What data are they holding for us? What's the risk if this goes down? So you need to be thinking about doing those kind of business impact assessments on those systems and services to really understand, okay, these are the 5, 10, 15 most critical third parties that we work with. And then I'd expect for those third parties that you have a higher level of control. So you meet with them more frequently. You actively kind of get engaged with understanding how they are managing things on behalf of your business. Maybe you subject them to your kind of internal audit cycles and send people in to actually look at some of the processes that they've got. You obtain details of all of their kind of security certifications. So, you know, are they compliant with standards such as ISO 27001? Do they have things like Cyber Essentials Plus? And actually, for some of these third parties, you might even go further than that. So you might just say, right, show me the SOC 2 reports that you've got over some of these processes. I want to see that you've got the right things in place there. I want to make sure that these controls that you're claiming to have actually operate and are fit for purpose and that they cover the right things for us. You've also got to make sure that your response is aligned with the other activities that you do in your organization from a risk management perspective. So third-party risk should not be some kind of extra or add-on to your risk management processes. It should be really embedded in there. So, you know, this needs to be on your risk registers. You need to make sure that when you're thinking about your organizational risks, that third-party angle is getting considered and that the business really understand what their exposure is. Your risk management approach has got to be comprehensive as well. So this kind of comes back to the point that David was making earlier on those bits around the edge. So how do we make sure we catch all of those? How do we really understand where our data is going and who's got access to all of this? So I worked with a pension scheme who do a lot of the kind of administration, you know, pass that out to a big outsourcing company. And actually, the levels of abstraction that exist in those processes with other third parties kind of coming into it is huge. So even so far as there's companies that they've got that they employ specifically to print letters. And obviously, because they're printing letters, they get access to things like names and addresses of these people. They get access to the content of some of these letters, which can potentially be quite sensitive. And my client didn't necessarily know that that was going on, that all of that was there, and that these third parties, that something could happen to such a small third party in the grand scheme of things that could have such a big impact on themselves. And then really the kind of other points around this, you know, embedding your risk management activities within your organization, generally just good practice. But I think the one that really matters is being dynamic. And I think this is really important given the speed and I guess just the pace of adoption of some of these cloud technologies and how quickly the landscape changes. So one of the things with cyber threats that you've kind of always got to be aware of is that it's constantly evolving. So, you know, what was an effective hack 2 or 3 months ago, that's outdated, that's gone. There's already something else coming. So many of these kind of zero-day exploits that exist. And you've got to find a way as an organization to try and make sure that you're able to, at least to some extent, keep up with that. So that's not to say you've got to be the one that goes out there and identifies every single one of these new vulnerabilities and how it applies to all of your third parties, but you've got to think about what your mechanisms are in place for kind of looking at that sort of stuff. So it might even be that you employ third parties to do some of that kind of monitoring for you. And the important thing to remember with all of this is it's all specific to your business. So there is no one size fits all approach to this. You've got to kind of make sure that your response is right for you. And sometimes that's quite hard, but it is definitely possible. And the way that I always kind of think about it is just start with the basics, treat those third parties like you would treat it if it was your internal process. Think about what those risks are. Think about what sources of assurance you would be comfortable with as a business to get comfort over those processes and just go from there. So what are some of the questions that you can actually ask around this then? So first, things like what kind of data should I actually be putting on the cloud? What regulatory or compliance requirements affect you? So I think those are quite important questions just to kind of get that sense for, okay, what am I actually willing to share with these third parties? You've then got to think about, okay, how do I make sure that my data is segregated? And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but with public cloud, you're sharing infrastructure with people. So you've got to make sure that you're not exposed if they're exposed. So how do they control that? How do these third parties make sure that there is that segregation in place that there needs to be? perhaps two of the most important questions here: who's liable when things go wrong? What are the procedures for actually remedying it? And what are the recovery and continuity procedures in the event of a loss of service? So this is one of those areas where you maybe don't have that much control, especially with the big third parties. Now, they're going to commit to recovery times for you that you're kind of going to have to find a way to deal with. So are you willing to accept the recovery times that they're offering? And if you're not, what are the mitigating activities that you can put in place to make sure that you can get things back online and working, or to a point from a data perspective where you're happy with it? And then finally, you've got to think about the kind of monitoring and reporting mechanisms. So how do you make sure that you do that effectively? How do you make sure that you have good oversight of the processes? How do you make sure that what is migrated to the cloud is as well controlled as if it was in your organization? Because ultimately the risk is broadly the same. And then that last point, just how can we change service providers or exit the contract without incurring additional costs? So this comes back to that portability piece. It's making sure that you do always have that kind of ability to get out if the service isn't quite what you expected, or if your direction as a business changes. So what are the key takeaways from this then? First, third-party IT risk needs to be managed like any other risk. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So all of these third parties might be doing a great job. If there's one that's not, that's still going to be your area of compromise. So you've got to make sure you've got a real good understanding of what's going on out there and what's where. Due diligence is good, but it's not enough on its own. So a lot of organizations that I work with kind of come back to me and say, oh, well, we did some due diligence when we actually engaged with them. We asked them some questions and we got copies of their ISO 27001. But really, there's not that much going on beyond that. So absolutely great that you've done your due diligence, but you need to do more. Even in the most well-controlled environments, things are going to happen. So you've got to make sure that you've got a plan. And I think this is probably the key, the most important thing to take away from this is you need to prepare. You can't just rely on the names and the brands that are involved in some of this and say that they're going to make sure that everything's all right. You need to understand what your exposure is, and you need to have plans in place to deal with it. And that's it. So just thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I can take some questions now. Okay,
thank you for that, Matt. We've just got two questions really, and two more of observations really. The first one on the questions is, when you're defining your due diligence and sort of like your spec or whatever that you're trying to outsource, you may not have the skills in house. How would you go about doing it?
Well, I suppose that the easiest way to say that is get a consultant in that does know what they're doing. And generally, I do think that's not a bad idea. So there are always going to be elements of your business where you don't necessarily have that specialist resource in-house. And you've kind of got to weigh up what is the advantage of getting someone in, maybe paying someone to come in and look at this for me, versus what you can get out of it in the long run. So having someone who is really knowledgeable about these processes come in and help you just establish those processes, get you started on the right path and give you some ideas for going forward, that can actually be a big help. Obviously, that's not always going to be suitable, depending on your organization and your budgets and things like that. So if you really do have to go it alone, I think it starts with the fundamentals. You can start with those basic questions. What have I got? Where is it? How are they protecting it? How do I make sure that I've always got access to it when I need to it? And just ensuring that kind of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. I think that has to be the kind of starting point.
Okay, and just time for a quick one then. And you mentioned that someone had got effective change management processes or robust ones, and somebody else had ineffective change management. Yeah. What did you mean by the difference between the two?
So to give you an example of an effective change management, in that instance, all the changes that would be made to that client's systems were going through appropriate testing. They would be reviewed and signed off. They were kind of doing impact assessments on when these changes should go live and making sure that it was at good times for the business. In the example where things weren't going so well, some of these changes were being just pushed directly to production with no testing, no sign off, no real clear authorization, which frankly, I'm amazed that it hadn't already caused much more serious issues than it had.
Okay, thank you for that. And so just quickly time to say thank you to everybody for joining us today on the presentation, and to thank the IRM for organising and hosting the presentation, and of course our presenters Matt and David, and that we hope to see you at one of our future events. And if you've signed up for the updates, the details will then appear in your inbox. But if you've not signed up, then and you want to see about any future meetings, please head over to the IRM's website, and you'll be able to make sure that you don't miss any of the events that the IRM host. So just on behalf of Ian and the Northwest Committee and myself again, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.